So before we get into the new record, I'd like to jump back a little bit to just after Human Performance, because you kind of did your own things in that period. What was the mentality coming back to Parquet Courts and heading towards the new album?
Like any time that we begin the process of doing a record, the idea is, how do we do something that is simultaneously, very Parquet Courts, but also very different from the last thing that we did. And so that interim between Human Performance and the next record, Wide Awake, it's actually the longest time that we've taken in between LPs. And yeah, we worked on other stuff and were able to write songs, and it was probably the most kind of intensive songwriting and demoing process that we've ever done, and just basically concentrating on how we were going to make this record different, how we were going to record it, where we were going to do it, building up the right amount of material for it. And I think I was probably cognizant to make something that was a little bit more rhythm forward and less, Human Performance is a very melody-driven record. I think Wide Awake is a very rhythmic record, definitely very drums and bass forward. But most of those things, they can't be planned.
Okay.
They happen when you're doing it.
Yeah, because it's in the bio as well. But one of the things on this record is getting people to move. It's like you say, it's more rhythm based. So so that wasn't conceived of before you started the process.
Well, I did feel like I wanted to make a record that people could dance to.
Okay. And you mentioned kind of the output you had as a group, and you had 5 albums in 8 years, aside from all the other things that you've done. So, which is quite prolific in this time and age. So what do you attribute that to? Why do you think you have so much coming out?
I think that it helps that we're 4 people working together as a band, and maybe if it was just one of us as a singer and songwriter with a backing group, it would maybe be more difficult to be productive. I think that 4 creative guys working together helps motivate and challenge everyone to stay productive, and I think also it just feels good to be productive and stay busy and stay interested in what we're doing. And I think the more that you're able to work and create, then the more interested and focused you can be, and inevitably more productive.
And the more you can tour.
Fair enough. And you mentioned that you want to evolve, but also keep elements of that makes you. So, is that difficult after making 4 albums? This being the 5th one, that to reinvent yourself without losing some of yourself?
This is actually the 6th.
6th.
It's difficult in that you have to decide, what parts of your identity do you keep and which parts do you discard? Like, what's important to us about being Parquet Courts? What is it? There's so many things that, cultivate the identity of Parquet Courts, and you have to kind of decide what that's going to be. And it's always changing and it's always in flux. Really, it's like you have to. At first, you just have to start writing and start writing what is coming to you, and then if it's very different, which a lot of this stuff was, the question is then how do I make this work within the context of what we do?
And what was especially for this album then, Wide Awake, what was the answer to that question for what is the identity of Parquet Courts? Did you find kind of what you were looking for on this record?
Well, I think a lot of the aesthetic elements of Parquet Courts are there. A certain kind of
I think there's a really free spirit to the group, is what we, or yeah,
That's what I was going to say.
I think that's what we discovered throughout making Wide Awake, is that we can maintain our free spirit, and I think that's like what we really were able to embrace with, and is at the very essence of the group, and it's less about sticking to certain musical styles or genres and more about being open to go wherever we feel like going or wherever the music might take us.
Were you influenced by particular sounds or particular artists in the lead up to writing this album?
Definitely feel like we were listening to some dub. I think that comes through on the bass. I was definitely listening to some disco, you know, a lot of 80s American punk, whole mix of stuff really, but that's pretty typical.
Because I read somewhere that Townes Van Zandt was also part of kind of that.
Love Townes Van Zandt.
How does he factor into kind of what you do, his music?
I was listening to a lot of Townes just coincidentally when we were making the record, as well as like dub and disco and punk, like Andrew was saying, and yeah, he's got like a
great storyteller.
A great storyteller and a real knack for interesting melodies, and yeah, I think that it sneaks its way in there and can be inspiring too when you kind of run out of ideas.
In that sense, then, with the writing, is it fair to say that the focus is maybe a little bit more on storytelling on this record?
Well, at this point, I think I consider myself, well, not a storyteller, but a lyricist, probably before a songwriter at this point. It's just kind of, it's the main vehicle for what I do, and you know, the songwriting, I like to think is informed more by the lyrics than vice versa.
Mm. In that sense, then, what was one of the first kind of, maybe one or two songs that got born, or where the ideas were born?
I know I had Mardi Gras beads left over from the last session that we had done. I think that we had talked about Total Football was one of the first.
Total Football
songs.
was kind of, yeah, one of my first ones.
Because lyrically, then, were you? I mean, there's so much going on in the world. Were you looking for certain elements or certain things to talk about?
Yeah, for sure. The challenge for me was to make a record that expresses both elements of anger and joy, and to do it in a way that's not considered trite or, you know, reactionary or, you know, nihilistic or unconstructive, to do it in a way that we hadn't before, and to maybe focus it in a more specific direction rather than a more kind of generalized malaise, to kind of zero in on exactly what, you know, I want to say. That's typically where any body of work starts, is you have to figure out what you're saying.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned that nihilism, which comes back in some of the lyrics. So why is it important not to go down that route and not to?
Because the whole world is going that way right now, and it's important as artists to stand against it.
Mm. And then, because part of it, I read as well, there's this dichotomy between individualism and collectivism, and
Sure.
that's kind of, you're navigating those two things on the album as well.
Yeah.
So where did that idea arise from?
Well, I think, you know, people, especially our age and younger, are tired of this old idea of, you know, especially within the context of America, you know, the lone wolf, the, you know, the individual, like, you know, the the concept of American individualism. People want something new, and I think people, especially now in our country, feel a need to be collective. But the only way collectivism can work is if individuality is recognized. So it's especially Total Football is the lyrics to it are very much in a kind of like declarative manifesto style, and it's no mistake that it's the first song on the record. It's the introduction. It's kind of the the ideological introduction to the rest of the record.
Right. Well, if we go on, then the next track, "Violence," for instance, how does the idea or the concept of violence factor into what you've just said? The kind of that idea of well, I wrote the lyrics down, but I forgot them. I misplaced them. But I seem to remember something about that. It's almost in our nature, the violence, that it's kind of inevitable in a way.
Well, I don't think it's inevitable, and I don't think it's in our nature either. But it is very commonplace as an American. It's so commonplace that when you hear about it, these kind of mass episodes of death, you don't react to it because it happens so much. You don't cry, you don't really take the time to mourn because it's so commonplace, and that's scary when you can't even react to something that devastating. So violence is a way of us reacting to that, of us taking a minute to kind of mourn. I mean, it's a heavy song, and it's a very kind of I guess cathartic song, but also it's funky. You can dance to it, and that's kind of it's kind of what I wanted to do is give us and the audience an opportunity to have this kind of dual release, to be able to release joy and anger. You can work things out through dancing, but I guess that's kind of a thing on New York City observation too, because I would consider poverty a form of violence.
Right.
You witness this so much in America, and especially in New York. You witness poverty, you witness violence, and then the question is like, what can I do? How do I react to this? As an ethical person, there's this sort of kind of mental gymnastics that you have to do to decide, how am I going to react to this? And our choice of reaction was making this record.
Yeah, you mentioned the word catharsis. So is that kind of, as songwriters, what you're looking for through music? Is that why you write and why you perform?
I think you can find catharsis in writing music. I don't know if I necessarily look for it on purpose.
Well, let me put it differently then. This might sound weird, but what is the intent of these lyrics in a way? Because, like you said, there's also a certain release in the music. So, with the lyrics, do you want people to think about something? Do you want them to engage in a way?
Yeah, of course. I wouldn't write lyrics if I didn't want people to engage in them. You want people to, just like any form of art, it's an expression of the artist, and that expression hopefully results in some sort of engagement between the artist and the audience. I think that engagement would be, best if it's some sort of emotional or mental, like cerebral stimulation. But for me, a lot of writing is cathartic because as a fan of art, I'm attracted to other people's catharsis because it's relatable. And right now, I think that these are things that the topics in the record are things that people can relate to.